Pokemon's latest mechanic, Trainer's Pokemon, looks very fun and flashy, sure, but they have been flopping massively, only winning 5% of the events where they have been legal. So I did some investigating into why that is, by looking at all 171 events where they have been legal. And I found out that the best owner's Pokemon card, the one that took over the Champions League event in Fukuoka, is a card that many people have overlooked. What is this new mechanic exactly then? Well, owner's Pokemon have been in and out the format since the Team Rocket days, all the way back in 2000. And back then, there were metagame titans too, with cards like Rocket Zapdos, which rocked the format. These are essentially normal Pokemon, but they have their owner's name and pictures on the card as well. And these open the door to having special kind of supporting cards or interactions, like how Team Rocket's Hideout would give Rocket's Pokemon an extra 20 HP for example. However, these new ones that we are getting so far haven't been living up to the past great owners Pokemon cards, like Rocket Zapdos, Luxray GR Level X, and Dialga G Level X. To illustrate this point, let's look at Iono's Pokemon, cause sure, they are flashy, but they are falling short. Iono's Belly Bolt is the main deck engine. With its Electro Streamer ability, you can attach as many lightning energy from your hand to your Iono Pokemon as you like in a turn. This is obviously very strong, and we have seen abilities like these be very successful in the past, like Blastoise winning the 2015 World Championships for example. So if cards like Blastoise can do well, why can't Iono's Belly Bolt? Considering Belly Bolt is a stage 1 and Blastoise is a stage 2, it should be much easier to get Belly Bolt into play, it should be dominating. Well, if we look at the rest of the Iono cards, you will understand why, because Iono's Pokemon have a huge problem. Let's see if you can figure it out. Next up, let's look at Iono's Kilowattrel, which has a very good ability to Flash Draw, which lets you discard a lightning energy so you can draw till you have 6 cards in your hand. This is a good amount of card draw, letting you draw 1 card higher than other stage 1s, like Bibarel and Octillery have done in the past. But then you have the downside of having to discard a lightning energy. But since you have a lot of them lying around from Belly Bolt, it also means you can sort of Iono proof yourself since you always have a way to draw cards as long as there's a lightning energy on the Pokemon. So it's actually pretty good. So we only have 2 more Iono's Pokemon to look at, and have you worked out the problem with this archetype yet? Iono's Electrode knocks itself out, and then you get to flip a coin. If heads, your opponent's active is KO'd as well. If tails, nothing happens to your opponent's Pokemon. And let's be honest, Electro Ball really isn't worth talking about. So we can't realistically rely on this Electrode to do us well. It's just too risky. I mean, 50% of the time you're knocking yourself out for no reason. So the big problem with the Iono deck is that there just isn't any good attackers. Belly Bolt doing 230 for 4 energy is just very mid. So there just isn't any good recipient for all those lightning energy which you can pile down very fast. Now, Iono's Voltorb does have the Chain Bolt attack, which does deal 20 plus 20 for each lightning energy attached to your Iono Pokemon, which does sound good on paper, but you will need 11 in play to be hitting 240 damage, which just gets you to one-shotting basic EX Pokemon, which is already asking a lot. 11 energy is quite hard to get in play. Now, I guess since you are a one-prize Pokemon, this gives you slightly more wiggle room, but it's just too much energy to be asked on to be reused reliably. And this is reflected with its City League performance in Japan, with the Iono archetype not winning a single one out of the 170 that I looked at. And it didn't even get a top 16 placement at the Champions League event in Fukuoka, which is the first big event with all these cards being legal. In fact, it looks like Iono's best chance of doing well is when it's paired with Raging Bolt to attack, since with a couple Raging Bolt EX and some fighting energy, you can give Raging Bolt a nice little draw engine via Kilowattrel that it traditionally never had. But even then, Teal Mask exists as a basic. These are all stage 1s, so it's not looking good for Iono. One important thing worth mentioning is that all of these cards will only exist in a post-rotation format for us and Japan. This checks up the metagame massively, since big decks like Regidrago, Dialga and Lugia V-Star have all gone. One of the format's biggest removals was Manaphy, meaning outside of Rabscar, benches are all vulnerable to damage. This has led to decks like Slowking starting to do well, where you use Slowking Seek Inspiration attack to cheat hefty attacks for 2 energy, since it lets you discard the top card of your deck, and you can use any one of the attacks from the Pokemon card that got discarded in this way, as long as it hasn't got a rule box. So this, with Academy at Night and Cypher Maniac's code breaking, is ripe for abuse, since now you can use Conkeldurr's Gutsy Swing for a nice big 250 damage, Regigigas to annihilate Terra Pokemon, Annihilate to straight up KO both actives, and of course the big one, Curum's Triforce, dealing 110 damage to any 3 of your opponent's Pokemon. So yeah, your bench Pokemon aren't safe. And there's actually one more deck that abuses your opponent's bench that does feature an owner's Pokemon in it, but we will look at that after we analyse the Hop mechanic. Me and I think the rest of the Pokemon community were stunned when we saw the reveals for Hop's Pokemon. They look insane on paper. First up, Dubwol lets you swap your opponent's active when you evolve into it. This ability is always super strong in format, with cards like Lycanroc GX, Umbreon VMAX and Luxray GR Level X all seeing play at the highest of Pokemon stages. From what I can find though, it hasn't really been lighting the world on fire. It has seen some experimental play in decks like Raging Bolt and Golden Go, because to be fair, a bit of gust on those decks without having to give up your supporter for the turn is actually rather good, but even that hasn't been too popular. The biggest Hop card has to be Zacian EX, and much like its older brothers, it hits super hard. It has the attack Close Cleave, which does 30 damage to the active and 30 to a bench Pokemon, which we have seen a good few times at the top of the metagame with cards like Landorus EX and Buzzwole GX. The selling point of the card though has to be Brave Slash, which deals a colossal 240 damage for 4 energy. That might seem rather high, but please remember that we do have really good Meta Acceleration via Metang and Archaludon, so that hefty 4 energy cost realistically isn't much of a problem. But to be fair, when we're attaching 4 energy, we want to be hitting more than 240 damage, right? I mean, that's not far off what Voltorb was doing for 11 lightning energy earlier, and back then I said that still really wasn't good enough. For that amount of energy, we want to be ejecting everything in the format out of our way. Well, luckily Creatures Inc. thought so too, because they gave Hop Pokemon a myriad of ways to boost up their damage, with cards like Postwick, which boosts your Hop's Pokemon damage by 30 as a stadium, Hop Snorlax, which does the same via an ability, but you can only apply one of them at a time. And lastly, and maybe most importantly, we have Hop's Choice Band, which increases the damage of the attack done by 30 for the Hop's Pokemon it's attached to, and reduces an energy cost on their attacks as well. So under ideal circumstances, Zacian EX can now hit for a table-shattering 330 damage, which is the perfect amount for clearing realistically everything out of the way. There's even a Hops Battle VIP Pass type card, which lets you grab any 2 basic Hop Pokemon and put them straight onto your bench, which is insane. So with all those good points, has Zacian been dominating the metagame then? So from the 170 city leagues that I looked at, it has won a few, with it mostly being a one-off in Archaludon decks as a big hitter. And at the Champions League event in Fukuoka, it didn't have a top 16 placement at all. So while the potential is there, it hasn't done anything in a major way apart from win some League Cup equivalents, which is a bit sad. Next up, we have everyone's favourite, and I'm sure the comments have already been lighting me up saying, how can Zoroark EX be doing poorly? Well, let me explain. There's no denying the card has some selling points. The tradability is obviously insane, which we have seen do really well in the past with cards like Gardevoir via Curlia, Empoleon back in the day, and the GOAT Zoroark GX. We cannot argue that this is a fantastic ability. Its attack lets you use any one of your benched Ends Pokemon's attacks as this attack. Sound familiar? Very similar to Mew VMAX. The most obvious attacker off the bat is Ends Reshiram, which does a nice 170 damage and has a beefy Outrage attack as well. But Enstar Manatan is a real big hitter. First up, dealing 30 damage for each basic energy in your opponent's discard, meaning this can add up really fast against decks like Raging Bolt and Gardevoir. Its second attack does 90 to the active and 90 to a bench Pokemon. Without Manaphy in format, this has free reign to dissect your opponent's board state, but you do have to discard all the energy attached to you. Now this might not be as disastrous as you previously think, even though Dark Patch rotates, because we do get Ends PP up, which attaches a basic energy to a benched Ends Pokemon. So what we have here is a deck that can draw a ton of cards via trade, has a bench attack, but does lack a reliable big hitter. Zoroark has won a few city leagues, and from what I've seen, there are even some lists experimenting with binding Mochi and Petulant EX2 to boost the damage. I even heard of some lists experimenting with this Zoroark, with its illusionary jacking attack that deals 60 damage for each EX or V Pokemon your opponent has in play. But bear in mind, this Zoroark cannot evolve from Zoroark. And to be fair, a Zoroark deck did make a top 16 placement at Fukuoka, so it's probably one of the more successful owners Pokemon we've looked at so far, but I think Zoroark will be much more successful as a draw engine for another archetype than it will be as an attacking archetype. So I'm just not convinced the core is good enough to support it. But hey, I'm happy to be wrong. However, lastly, we have by far the most successful owners Pokemon that took over the Champions League event with 3 in top 16, and that is Lily's Clefairy. Now this is a super interesting card. Its ability gives all dragon types in play a ×2 weakness to Psychic, which is super fun. And since Dragapult and Raging Bolt are still ruling the format in a big way, having this ability to help get them out the active and into the discard pile is nice. And its attack is decent as well. Full Moon Rondo does 20 damage plus 20 for each bench Pokemon in play. So it can hit for 220 with full normal benches, or even 340 if benches are max. And remember, you can times that by 2 if it's hitting into a dragon type Pokemon. Both of these factors help Lily's Clefairy see some play as a standalone deck when paired with Teal Mask Ogerpon to accelerate energy, which did okay but not super well at the City League's event. But at the Champions League event in Fukuoka, Tord and his testing group all played one Clefairy in their Terra Crispin box deck, where you accelerate energy to Wellspring Ogerpon as fast as possible via Teal Dance and Crispin, so you can use Torrential Pump as much as possible. With no Mana Theme format, this Torrential Pump can rip your opponent's board apart. And with Knocked Out to help you keep ticking over, this was very easy to keep doing. I had a friend Carter who was at that Champions League event and who had tested with Tord and Rahul before. So I asked him about the Clefairy and why it was in there. And he told me that Clefairy had a few uses. The most obvious was to clear the way of Raging Bolts and Dragapults easily. It was also a very sneakily good attacker to deal with Blood Moon Ursaluna and even end Zoroark as well. And since you can power it up fast via Teal Dance or Crispin, it is a fantastic attacker to have as a backup. The rest of Lily's cards are pretty, well, meh to be honest, with the Pearl Tool card being the only real interesting standout, which reduces the prize card of the Lily's Pokemon it is attached to by 1 when it's KO'd. So the Clefairy from earlier would only give up 1 prize card when it gets KO'd instead of 2, which is kind of fun to be fair. And Lily's Rabombi, when you evolve into it, becomes a captivating Pokepuff, which is kind of decent and might see some play in control decks at some point. But that's pretty much it for Lily's Pokemon, which makes me sad because it's so close to greatness. But in the current way Lily's Clefairy is being used, it actually makes no difference that it's an owner's Pokemon. It could be a normal EX card and it really wouldn't matter. So far that makes me think that owners Pokemon have been a bit of a flop. But don't worry, the future is looking good, since at the Champions League event Cynthia's Garchomp line was revealed, and it is looking beefy. A 330 HP stage 2 Pokemon with a free retreat cost, it can attack for 1 energy, 100 damage, and then you can draw to have 6 cards in your hand. And its second attack would deal 260 damage. Sounds a bit low, but bear in mind Roserade will boost that by 30 for each one in play, so with 2 of these in play, you're hitting for big damage. And it even has a tool card that can boost it to 400 HP. Madness. Steven's Metagross can attach metal and psychic energy from the discard pile, meaning it can recycle attackers at ease. But the one I'm most excited for is Ethan's Pokemon. Ho-Oh, which lets you attach 2 fire energy from your hand to your benched Ethan Pokemon, is fantastic. Macargo hits up to 350 damage, and Ethan's Quilava lets you search out Ethan Supporter, which gets you 3 fire energy or Ethan Pokemon in any combination. So the future's looking good, but right now I think owners Pokemon have a lot to prove in a competitive metagame. But hey, you never know, someone might break them to play them when we get our hands on them in Journey together. Only time will tell. If you made it this far, like the video and consider subscribing. About 90% of you that watch these videos aren't subscribed, and well, that makes me sad. And why don't you watch this video here, where I cover the most important coin flip in Pokemon history.